Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Benji Louie, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the AALS Clinical Sections Teaching Methodologies Committee. I'm joined by Paul Redvani, who is also one of the committee members. Welcome to part one of Teaching Ideas for Incorporating Anti-Racism in In-House Clinics and Externships. Our committee wanted to find a way to contribute to the dialogue that was occurring in the clinical conference in the spring, where efforts to combat anti-racism in clinical legal education were discussed. So we have our distinguished presenters who will offer some practical tools for teaching anti-racism. Each presenter will have will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and we should have time for questions at the end. As you think of questions, please send them directly to our facilitator, so that's Paul Redvani, at Redvani, R-A-D-V-A-N-Y, at Fordham, F-O-R-D-H-A-M.edu.
They could just chat it, I think, Benji, if that's all right. You could just chat me directly instead of chatting everyone.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So here are our presenters. We'll first hear from Richard Frankel from the Drexel Klein School of Law, where he is the Associate Dean of Experiential Learning and Director of the Civil Litigation and Dispute Resolution Program. Professor Frankel studies the intersection of civil rights, civil procedure, and federal courts. Next, we'll hear from Artika Tyner from the University of St. Thomas School of Law. Dr. Tyner serves as a law professor and founding director of the Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice. Her research focuses on diversity and inclusion, community development, and civil rights. And last, we'll hear from Angela Cornell, who is a clinical professor at Cornell Law School and founding director of the Labor Law Clinic. She also teaches doctrinal courses, including labor law, practice, and policy. This year, she is a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. So we can do a virtual hand clap for our presenters. Okay, okay. All right, so we will first hear from Professor Richard Frankel.
Hi, good afternoon. And I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. So if you have any problem hearing me, let me know. I don't want to come here claiming to have, I don't feel that I'm someone who has any sort of expertise in this area, especially when I look at the experience of my co-presenters. I feel very much that I'm someone who's still in the process of learning and trying to listen. I don't feel that I'm particularly effective at teaching about systemic racism and race and racial justice, but I have tried a few things in some of my courses, and this is one that I want to talk about. About 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know what the exact circumstances were, but there was something that happened in our law school community that raised questions of diversity, and I think some members of our African-American community didn't feel supported by the larger community at the law school. And so following that, I tried to devise a lesson plan for one of my courses that would try to get people to think about the role of sort of speaking out, being an ally, and how to think about that in a different way. But I didn't want to do it in a way that I felt like where I was just sort of telling people the importance of trying to be an ally, but a way to kind of, where they could kind of come to it in their own way. And so at the time, I'm from Pennsylvania. There was this scandal in Pennsylvania called Porngate. Can everyone see my screen? Where the Attorney General of Pennsylvania released a whole series of emails that various public officials had been sending around, including several members of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that were racist, sexist, and otherwise inappropriate. One justice resigned, and this other justice, Michael Aiken, at the time had not yet he decided to resign, but he was caught in the scandal. And so I gave students some information about this scandal, some examples of some of the emails that had been sent around, and I asked them a series of 3 questions that we sort of explored during the class. So the first question, if I can go to the next slide, was suppose you were a female victim of sexual harassment in the workplace. You bring a discrimination claim and it ultimately goes to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And I asked them how they would feel if Justice Aiken is on the court after all of this information had come out. Would he be a fair judge of the claim? And this led to sort of a wide-ranging discussion with a variety of viewpoints, but what came out of it was, well, lots of judges, ultimately judges bring their values into their decisions, whether we want them to or not. And if you start making judges recuse themselves all the time, we'd be recusing every judge in lots of sorts of cases, and it might not be a realistic solution. And what the students came up with is it would be better if the judges on our bench really sort of understood different perspectives and to see how, different actions can, what the effects of those actions can have, so that if, there was better learning and sort of discussion and understanding of different perspectives, that might help decision-making, but we can't necessarily take judges off the court for a particular case. And so that then that was where we came out after the first question. So I used that as a prompt for the second question, which was to put the student in a slightly different perspective, say, now suppose you're a law clerk to the justice, and you happen to see one of these emails or more on the justice's computer, and this is how you learn about this. What would you do? Would you confront him? Would you resign? Would you ignore it? How would you respond to kind of learning this about the person you are working for who is in a position of power as a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court? And I think students had a harder time with this question, right? What they were struggling with was, we think it's important for the justice to know that these kinds of emails and this kind of behavior is inappropriate, but let's look at the power dynamic that this law clerk is in. I'm dependent on this justice, maybe for a recommendation. After this, I want to complete my clerkship. I don't really feel that I would be in a position because of the power dynamics to really be able to speak out. And it led to sort of discussions of the effects of power dynamics and how that can make, whether it's a victim or someone in a position of lower differential power, to recognize the difficulty that comes with trying to speak out in this kind of circumstance, in the situations that they might face. And so we're left with sort of a unsatisfied kind of what should we do in this sort of situation because of the conflicting feelings that they had about where this would lead. So we took that then to a third question, which was now, suppose you're a friend or an acquaintance or a colleague of the justice, whether it's just a friend from outside of work, maybe someone who's also sitting on the court, and you come across one or more of these emails and they're linked to the justice, and you have the same questions as number two, sort of how would you respond to this? And there, I think students were much more willing to say, yes, this is a situation where we need to confront, justice needs to be confronted, needs to be talked to about this. So now we're in sort of a position where power dynamics are not as present, and there's an opportunity to speak out, try to make him see how this might affect other people. And so that we can stop this behavior from continuing and to stop it perpetuating it. And that unless, you speak out in this kind of situation, we're going to continue to condone and sort of accept this kind of behavior. And so that's where we came out on the third question. And so the next question that I asked the students was, let's now take this away from Justice Aiken. And I said, suppose now it's not a justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, but it's a member of your law school community, another fellow student, or another member of another community that you are in, and you happen to see this kind of situation. Would you speak out, right? Would you try to stop that behavior from happening rather than staying silent because you're saying it didn't affect me directly? And I think what I liked about the exercise and doing it in this format was through that, I think students came to see for themselves, here's the cost of staying silent. It's hard to speak out, but we can see now from this example what the consequences are when I don't speak out. And when I translate it back to my own community, I can see how when something happens to a fellow student of mine, it's not just up to that student to speak out, but it's up to all of us to speak out and take a stand to not allow this kind of behavior to continue or to be perpetuated. And so I took it from an old example from a few years ago, but I've taught that lesson a couple of times since then. There's obviously lots of other sort of probably more current news events in which you could use it. But I think the feedback I got from students was that it did help make them see things in a little bit of a different way. And that it came to them sort of by surprise in a way that they were not expecting. And that's what sort of helped them maybe see it a little bit. So that's the lesson that I've tried and shared today in case it's helpful for anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. So we're going to move on now to Dr. Tyner.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you today for the opportunity to talk about some tangible ways I'm teaching about anti-racism and building a just and inclusive society. For me, it's bigger than my research. It's more important than my pedagogy. It's rooted in my own experience. And being a law student myself, I found the legal educational system lacking in many ways. The first one being that inclusive environment where I could truly thrive, bringing in both the diversity of my strengths, my racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, but more importantly, being more than a token or someone that just happens to be a part of the law school community, being a part of the entirety of the experience and being able to build upon my own passions around racial justice and social justice to be impactful. So I describe this as moving from the margins into the center. I had this experience when I was in clinic under the mentorship and under the guidance of my clinical law professor, Professor Nikema Bibi Armstrong. She was what gave me a glimpse of hope while I was in law school. Those clinical experiences of making service learning and making social justice and social change come alive in some tangible ways. If only I had that experience a bit earlier, would it have changed my overall excitement about law school or engagement about law school? So I thought 16 years later, here's my chance to continue to give that invitation to all students, not some, and make sure that my classroom does not focus on putting a student, spotlighting them when we're talking about, for instance, I still can remember the long lines waiting in my office to talk about, oh, is there a reasonable racist in some of the criminal procedure, criminal law cases? How do we talk about property when we're referring to people of color as chattel and not bringing it into contemporary times? So I knew that there was a challenge, that maybe I couldn't change legal education or change faculty, staff, or the administration, but I sure could navigate and create the type of pathway for our students to learn some key techniques around anti-racism. So when I think about this, first, it's rooted in practical teaching strategies and also pedagogical approaches. So in particular, starting off my career as a clinical law fellow, of course, it's related to experiential and applied learning. So for this particular course that I'm going to highlight on critical perspectives in race in the law, one of the things that we do through the service learning component is working directly with a community partner. And in this context, it's related to a legal question. So each student is working on a particular legal question. Everything from this past semester and looking at some of the healthcare disparities that we see at the intersections of race and poverty as it relates to COVID-19, as it relates to infant mortality. We also looked at land displacement and some of the constitutional law issues coming from questions raised by the Gullah Geechee Nation. So all these different components coming together. One of the things that I also was shocked about, primarily most of my students were third-year students, their lack of knowledge about the history of race in the law just in general, connection tangibly to the relevant case law, but also then coupling it with their responsibility to understand the law as a language of power and how to become well-versed in that language to be as impactful as possible. And so one of the ways that we used in teaching in the moment in real time was making sure that we were using case studies on contemporary civil rights and human rights issues. And in addition, our university, the University of St. Thomas, has been designated university-wide as a change-making institution. So I've been trained in the early days related to service learning, which has some of the same components of change-making, but thinking about how am I preparing my students to learn those new strategies around systems change, critical analysis, and also the strategic planning. So what does it look like? Here's an introduction directly to my syllabus and course description and general overview. It gives us a sense of, first of all, for a critical race class, I still didn't believe, as I said, many unexpected challenges, but many folks still struggle in thinking about what is race. That is race just something to say I'm Black or African American? Where does that come from? What is its relationship with the law? And in fact, one of the books that we start with is The Myth of Race, written by Professor Emeritus Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati. And one of the notions that we start off then with right away is this important piece of understanding that race is a social construct, but simultaneously understanding how race then has impacted law and policy in some tangible ways. So in particular, in our time together as well, I'm from a community called Rondo. So if you're not familiar with the Rondo community, we're not alone. We probably have a similar Rondo community right near you. If you traveled on a highway in your day-to-day life, most of the freeway systems in the early 1960s in America went through the heart of African-American communities and were called the path of least resistance, bringing in freeway systems in a case of racial removal in over 1,000 communities. So one of the things that I wanted students to connect anti-racism, social justice, leadership, and social change about some of the issues in their own backyard. Still yet today, we're dealing with the ramifications of displacement of the African-American community where I come from in Rondo, based upon the freeway and interstate system. It's not just Rondo. I said there are over 1,000 cases of documented racial removal. You also have everywhere from Tulsa, Oklahoma, as you've been looking at the racial massacre there, through the heart of the Greenwood district. I could name countless cities, but that's what helps to ground our students in that these issues have impact in real time. So we're taking the past, the history of the present, and helping us to shape the future. So in addition to that, one of the other books that we read is Groundwork. It's written about the work of the legendary Charles Hamilton Houston. And if you don't know him by introduction, he has that powerful quote that reminds us that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. Now, I hope we don't end up in that latter category, that we find and inspire our students especially to think about how they can be those social engineers using their analytical skills. And what I talk about all of our students having their toolbox, those writing skills, those advocacy skills, bringing them all together to be those advocates for justice and freedom in tangible ways. Dr. King described Charles Hamilton Houston as moving us from having roads and primarily maybe moving forward with pathways, but taking it to this highway of the civil rights movement that we know today through his both, notice what I'm going to say is a little inspiration for us all, his instruction as a law professor in addition to his work as a lawyer. If you do not know him, the best part of it is you know his students. You know Justice Thurgood Marshall, you know Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, some of those first federal Black jurists that took what they learned in the classroom and took it to radically transform the landscape of not just the jurisprudence of America, but the social fabric of America. So it's just a reminder of how powerful our roles are in making a difference. So with that, I also help to provide our students with a framework. I recently wrote a book called The Inclusive Leader, Taking Intentional Action for Justice and Equity. Why was this relevant to introduce to our students? Because I wanted our students to have a framework for action in some tangible ways. We oftentimes find ourselves in another bias training, doing another IDI, and doing the same things over and over again. Those might be helpful initially for the interpersonal level, that self-discovery, maybe unpacking a bias, maybe taking the implicit association test. Okay, those could be all starting grounds. Maybe it's the interpersonal piece. How do we address microaggressions? How do we move people together in some tangible ways, build strong teams together? We know the data shows us that diversity makes us brighter in some tangible ways, better results of innovation and creativity, which takes us to the organizational level. How do we manifest that in meaningful time? But also at the societal level. As we look at the model rules of professional responsibility, the American Bar Association reminds us that we need to create those moments to be those public citizens, to seek the advancement of access to justice and improvement of legal systems. So by introducing this framework, it gives our students a sense of that leadership starts with them today. It doesn't start next week, doesn't start a million years later. It's not for the next generation. It's right now. And it gives our students some tangible ways to think about how they have to engage all four of these strategies simultaneously and not just one. So what I'm really doing is igniting, and I earned my doctorate in leadership studies, igniting that piece of lawyers as leaders and how we can be impactful. So for instance, I'll close with this piece. I'm bringing in one of my sample lectures. And one of the things that we talked about is combining some of the civil rights components in history with human rights. How can we use this to understand? Some of our students looked at the 2019 year of return with the invitation from President Nana Akufo-Addo to come back to Ghana as the 400th year commemoration of the 1619 pieces. And so bringing all that together, what are the human rights components that can help to address some of the racial inequities experienced by, in particular, we see the greatest disparities in the African-American community. How do we combine human rights? How do we combine civil rights in some meaningful ways to bring forth change? I thought we could just start there. I learned very quickly, once again, that we needed to be rooted in a framework to have actionable plan. But before even getting to that, having the ability to discuss issues around anti-racism and not be lost in partisanship, not be lost in stereotypes and biases, but to be lost in a process of learning and growth, that then you turn that into being proactive in a growth mindset of taking where you are to where you need to be. According to Dr. Maya Angelou, we live in this rich multicultural tapestry in America, but unfortunately, in many ways, we've forsaken it. So here's the time to ignite and inspire our students on how we can all be a part of a growth mindset of learning. So we build it upon the framework that's created by Dr. Kendi. So our students, we did a bit of self-assessment, each and every one of us on an ongoing basis. Where are we? Which zone are we in? But how do we make sure that we're constantly in this zone and willingness around learning and growth while challenging those fear zones? But what can we do in particular? So with each class, I open up with theory and practice. For instance, I talked about Marcus Garvey. None of my students had ever heard of Marcus Garvey, but it was an opportunity to teach leadership lessons, to reflect upon history, to think about how they would frame justice and freedom in the context of anti-racism. I also had an opportunity to talk about Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Once again, none of my students had ever heard of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. But the reality of it is, if we're looking through a legal perspective, he was helping to organize and lay the foundation for what we know today is not just the Pan-Africanism movement, but the connections and bridges globally around racial justice. So you see the pictures here with Dr. King being in Ghana, and I'm a professor like everybody else, so I have to give a little homework. Make sure that you read Dr. King's sermon after he came back home. He called it, and he looked at it as a birth of a new nation. So that's my little homework for you, to get a sense of how he talked about civil rights and human rights as a global united endeavor. I also, of course, would have been remiss if I didn't include in talking about Pan-Africanism, Kofi Annan and his contributions to a broader discourse on how law and policy impact the day-to-day lives of everyday people. So we would go through these quotes and connect it then to the readings that we were doing in the Myth of Race, the case that we would start with. So we did a full history of case history, going from Amistad to contemporary affirmative action cases today. How do we connect some of the dots related to these leaders? So last but not least, let me offer you just a few resources. I know this is just my brief, like TED Talk. Please, I'll have these resources and I'll put them in the chat as well. Please look at the PBS original series that looks at how do we build an anti-racist law school. And then also there's the Anti-Racist Clearinghouse of resources started by African-American female deans that started to bring some information together. And I also have a learning guide for you. So the culmination of all these pieces is really an invitation. It's not just about what's happening in the classroom. I think that's secondary to what's happening with us, what's happening with the type of communities that we are creating before students even arrive on campus. What is our commitment to anti-racism? Clearly, we don't know, because we still see challenges related to pay parity, to the tenure track, to access, to growth. What is the way that we will use tangibly to make sure we're modeling the way to then allow for the atmosphere to talk about these issues then in a clear and authentic way in the classroom? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tyner. Okay, so now we'll have Professor Angela Cornell.
Thanks to the AALS Clinical Section Committee on Teaching Methodologies and to the other panelists for their really helpful suggestions. Perhaps teaching labor law as a doctrinal class and in the clinic makes it easier in some ways to integrate material on race discrimination and broader issues of inequality and poverty than in other substantive areas. But in these courses, I can provide an overview of the labor market as well as more individualized exposure to discrimination. Although my clinic focuses on collective labor rights, we get a disproportionate number of race and national origin discrimination claims. So we have both sort of the broader picture and then also individual claims. I start this semester, let me share a screen. Okay. I start the semester by showing a great documentary on the sanitation workers strike, which is, as you may know, that was Dr. King supported the sanitation workers as part of his Poor People's Campaign. And it was an incredibly powerful strike. The sanitation workers in Memphis were struggling with horrific working conditions. And the video allows students to actually hear from the workers that describe the kinds of working conditions, working full time, but still being in poverty, eligible even for public assistance, and requiring public handouts in order to get by, and the inhumanity of racial discrimination in that context in 1968. In that strike, we see for the first time the use of the placard, "I am a man," which really drives home that powerful point of how dehumanizing racial discrimination can be. And I'll note that some may recall that it was in Memphis, Tennessee, that Dr. King was assassinated while he was supporting the sanitation workers strike. the documentary brings home very graphically the effect of racial discrimination in the South, but also extreme poverty, the connection between poverty and racism. I'm going to pull up a clip if I can. Gives you. Can you see it okay? Sorry, I'm trying to get out of it. There we go. Okay, so in that documentary, we see, as I said, the connection between racism and poverty, how powerful it can be. And towards the end of it, we talk about, well, what's the progress really been over the last 50 years? What kind of progress have we seen? For example, the minimum wage now is $7.25. You can still work a full-time job and live in poverty. Workers still have to, many work 2 and 3 jobs to get by. And so it really sort of helps to drive home those issues. And then we can move out into the broader context. So today, economic inequality is greater in the US than in any other advanced nation. Sometimes using comparative data shows how out of sync we are with other industrialized countries. Janet Yellen, when she was the Federal Reserve Chairman, denounced the income and wealth inequality that neared the highest levels in the past 100 years. This chart shows the way in which wages and productivity have been decoupled, and how the gains from productivity have gone up to the top echelons instead of to working people. This chart really shows dramatically how wage growth has been going to the upper 1% instead of to working people. Median household income adjusted for inflation is lower than it was a quarter of a century ago, according to Joseph Stiglitz. And economist Thomas Piketty shows that in the US over the last 30 years, the growth in income of the bottom 50% has been 0, whereas incomes of the top 1% have grown 300%. 44% of US workers are employed in low-wage jobs that pay a median annual wage of $18,000 and hourly wage of about $10.22. And we know that the poverty rate disproportionately affects workers of colors, Black and Hispanics. And that includes Black and Hispanic children, as you can see, a much higher poverty rate. Although educational attainment between African Americans and white workers has narrowed substantially, African American workers still earn 20% less than typical full-time white workers. And Black men in 2019 earned only 56 cents for every dollar earned by white men, a gap that's wider than it was in 1979. In a massive nationwide
Searching for white men.
In a massive nationwide correspondence experiment designed to measure patterns of discrimination by large US companies, which involved over 83,000 job applications at Fortune 500 employers that was released in July of this year, researchers confirmed widespread discrimination against Blacks at job postings from 20% of the company. And what's really disturbing about this study is that the discrimination was not centered in a certain part of the country like in the South. It was throughout the country. Family income inequality results in inequality of opportunity for our children. Even worse than income inequality is inequality of wealth and opportunity. The life prospects of young Americans is more dependent on the income and education of their parents than in other developed countries. So I use data to try to demonstrate discrimination and the impact of inequality, and particularly the impact on those more marginalized in our communities. I'll end there. I had to cut quite a bit to try to stick within the time constraints, but perhaps we can talk more about this in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cornell, and to all our professors. That was great. We're going to turn to questions, and people should feel free to, again, chat me directly, or just we can go to open mic in a few minutes. I wanted to start with Dr. Tyner. Dr. Tyner's Community Justice Project won a presidential award from President Carter relating to service learning. And I was wondering if Dr. Tyner could explain a little more detail about how her clinic works.
Yes, I helped to create what we know today as the Community Justice Project, a civil rights clinic. And in many ways, it was the first of its kind because we were so used to in clinical education, of course, serving our individual clients. But how could we really manifest systemic change and also engage in large-scale policy change through legislative advocacy? So it was a radically different skill set than what we had tapped into before. But once again, if I mention that toolbox, tapping into those same tools that lawyers are uniquely positioned to use. So for instance, just going and building upon the remarks of Professor Cornell, we can all sing these data points like a song at this point. We can say a Black boy born in the early 2000s has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in his lifetime. We can say that children, oh my, if they're not reading at the 4th grade level, the correlation that they would say is that we can create prison beds 10 years out. 1 in 4 American children are not reading at grade level. They're 4 times more likely to drop out of school, 3.5 times more likely to be arrested in their lifetime. Okay, we've heard the statistics at this point. And then the question becomes for all of us, as Professor Cornell gave the invitation, what will we do? If we're borrowing, and we brought Dr. King into the conversation, we know his last book is Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And to choose the latter is why we received this presidential award and the recognition. To have the opportunity to bring community together to work on tangible solutions. We helped to work on early on addressing some of the issues around gang databases, of who was in the gang databases, why? What about data privacy? Who was it impacting? And oftentimes I think we love as lawyers to look at potential intervention, but what are the prevention points? And one of the things that we knew, we had an opportunity with our students to travel to Homeboy Industries in LA. We knew that prevention was what? From Dr. and Father Gregory Boyle's comments, nothing stops a bullet like a job. So we worked on a first of its type and kind social enterprise to create jobs for young African-American males. So why am I bringing up the Community Justice Project in the clinic? It's not about the award. I think it's about what led up to the recognition. The ability, because I look at awards as more opportunities for platforms to be able to engage people around real issues. So it was about, instead of saying in my teaching mantras, we see a problem, we create a solution, we saw tangible challenges. We saw the data. We had heard it too many times. And we decided, instead of just reciting it again and again, what could we do to manifest change in real time?
That's great. Thank you so much. Benji, I think you had a question.
Yes, I do have a question. So, and this is for any of the presenters. So, in clinics, we do self-assessment, and we also encourage our students to do self-assessment, I should say. And so with racism, of course, you know, for students of color, they can do a self-assessment with no problem about, you know, what their biases may be towards another person of color. I'm always interested in what majority students, right, white students might feel with respect to their own biases. And, you know, addressing that can be very delicate. The nice thing about being in a clinic is that you have a small class, so to speak. And so I guess my question for any of the presenters is whether you have an assessment or a self-assessment tool that you use either in the beginning of your clinic or, you know, sometime during your clinic, where you ask students about their views on race.
I don't, but I would love to include one if anyone has one that they would want to send. The only sort of, I think that one way that we've gotten assessment from students, it's in a class not about race, but about gender. It's really about gender bias in the legal profession, where alumni have come back to talk about sort of female alumni have come back to talk about sort of what their experiences have been like, both in their summer jobs and as new associates, and kind of, and for other women students in the clinic, it's very, they can identify a lot with the experiences that they hear. And I think for a lot of male students, sometimes it's the first time sort of hearing about sort of the way that these sort of unconscious or little things that you know, now you can see sort of how they come across, you know, differently than maybe some of those things may have been intended. And so it's not, there's a chance to do a little bit of self-assessment after that, but that's, I guess that's as far as we've gotten.
That's an excellent question. There are two ways that we've worked on addressing this issue, and I'll just highlight it through our clinic, the Community Justice Project. Professor Libby Armstrong and I created a guidebook with related discussion questions that were brought into the classroom as part of our daily instruction. It's reflections on race, social justice, and leadership. So it had the prompts and different resources to spark the conversation, because I'm a believer that this is a part of just as close to us as breathing. Race is something that's ingrained in our rituals, our practices, and the taxonomic structures that impact our day-to-day life. So we made it a part of our daily instruction. In addition to that, some of the assessments that we've used in the past, of course, are the implicit association test from Harvard. And then let's just be pragmatic in a sense. One of my mentors is Dr. Agar Khan, and I know he was pioneering in helping to create the platform around clinical education. Part of it is oftentimes we're in our ivory towers. Literally, as I started to do some of my author visits, most universities are even physically gated from the communities that they're in. One of our first assignments was engagement in the community. We rarely had classes inside the law school within itself. Don't tell my dean, but we met outside the classroom. We met in places where, whether it was our local coffee shop, Golden Time, we met at the Somali Confederation Center to learn more about some of the challenges that were impacting our news brothers and sisters. A part of it is, if we think about racism, if we think about many of the challenges, Brian Stevenson said it best, it's about eliminating many of the challenges that keep us from being proximate from the issues. We are not a part of the issues when we're on our campus alone. We are not a part of the issues when we go back to our own zip code and where we live and we're talking about majority versus minority. We should be very intentional, as the way Dr. Khan was with orientation for all of the students at Antioch Law School, of living, working, playing, finding joy with the communities that they were working in partnership. So I think it's bigger than just an assessment. It's bigger than just reflection. It's also about the lived experience.
Thank you. Those were great answers. Professor Cornell, did you want to weigh in on this?
I'd say it's a great question, Benji, and I appreciate it. I don't ask that question, and I'm appreciating all of the suggestions that were made, and I'll have to try to see how do a better job with it. But no, I don't effectively do that.
Professor Cornell, there's a question from a participant here. They asked, do you ever have hear from students that you are cherry picking statistics in a way that's not even handed, or that people lie using statistics? Do you ever have that from students, and how, if you do you handle it?
I haven't had that criticism from students. How would I handle it if I had received it? Well, there's a lot of information out there. Actually, what I use is much broader. I really just try to provide, a broader view of labor in the context of the labor market and the impact, sort of the structural ways in which the labor market can have an adverse impact on certain vulnerable workers. But I haven't had that challenge, and I suppose there are some students that really are dissatisfied with the nature of the presentation, or some that feel that it doesn't offer enough. But on the other hand, it's a way. Unfortunately, we still get pushback on whether discrimination actually exists in society. So I feel as if at least acknowledging certain data is one way to push back a bit on that. There's really no way to satisfy all of the students when it comes to data, but at least I try to share a glimpse into a broader picture of how workers are affected, and issues of inequality and race.
Thank you. That's really helpful. If anybody wants to ask a question, just open mic and unmute. You're welcome to do that. I'll give you a few seconds. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the presenters, because you guys gave us so much information in such a short time. You guys did an outstanding job of really staying within the time limits we asked. So much appreciated. But it might mean we have a little more time, and obviously all three of you have so much more to share. So I'll give you a chance to add anything that obviously you weren't able to add given the short time frame. Maybe I'll just I'll allow any of you to add anything that you'd like to add.
I wouldn't mind adding one quick comment. I had to take out the slides on labor unions and workers of color, but in fact, it is very interesting. African Americans are more likely to be in labor unions, and in the course of the clinic, we've realized that in fact, the collective bargaining process and the alternative dispute resolution mechanism has worked out very well for our workers of color. So that's a component that I didn't get to include, but I have to say that there are many ways in which in the clinic we see the protection of the collective bargaining really benefiting workers of color, because it's so challenging to bring discrimination claims, but bringing them under a just cause kind of rubric by a collective bargaining agreement is really, really very, very effective. And it's just another dimension that I didn't get to include.
Thank you. Dr. Tyner, Professor Franklin, anything you guys want to add?
Not much, other than I would just, I'd love to hear ideas from privately or off list, just ideas other people have for ways of teaching to these issues, feedback you have for me from what you heard of that list, and I'm constantly looking to refine, change, and add things. So appreciate any feedback that you have, and appreciate the committee for giving me a chance to talk today.
One of the strategies that I also encourage everyone to think about is that pedagogical approach on teaching in the moment, challenging many of our students to think about being that detective. So I open every class. I'm teaching a doctrinal class now in administrative law, but I still treat it like a clinic, so don't worry. But focusing then on what are the contemporary issues. For instance, I opened the class up yesterday and talking about the debt ceiling. What were some of the considerations? Which administrative agencies will be impacted? Who would be impacted? How will they be impacted? So I just encourage you to all create those practices where you're engaging the students in real-time issues, because we oftentimes say it, Whitney Houston said it, she believes the children are the future, the young people are the future. We say all these young lawyers, we get it. But with preparing for the future is right now. So I highly encourage, and throughout my clinical model, one of the things that I did as well was assign our students to read all of our local multicultural newspapers and to identify what some of the legal issues were and policy issues, and to think about what would be some of the strategies that they would use to bring forth change. So in Minnesota, of course, that's Insight News and Spokesman's Reporter, Mshale, Sahan Journal, all those pieces. And I actually brought those journals and publications on campus. So one of the things I just want you to think about is how are you preparing students to use those skills in real time, see issues, once again, see the problems and create solutions in tangible ways.
That's great advice. Thank you. So we got a bunch of questions in the chat about will the slides be shared? So we will talk to the presenters in ALS and try and figure out a way to do that for the people who are interested. For the people who are watching, thank you so much for joining us. For our presenters, a huge thank you, incredibly helpful, incredibly informative, and incredibly relevant to all of our work that we're all trying to engage in at the moment. So we can't thank you guys enough for taking time out to prepare and to present today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.